Hello, in this presentation we will be talking about business law, asking the first question we generally ask with any new topic, and that is, what is it? Why do we need it? What will be the purpose of law? What will be the function of law? In discussing what law is, we can often take the approach of asking, what is it for? What is its use for? Why do we need the law? We will be discussing what the law is for and what its use will be. And we're also going to discuss the relationship, there's often considered to be one, between the idea of ethics and the idea of a legal system. So we want to know some ideas of ethics, what are some different ideas of ethics, and what is the law's relation to ethics, and if we change ethical principles or thoughts about ethical principles, does that change our definition or our idea of what the law is? So we'll list some ideas and theories about ethics, and we'll list some ideas and theories about what the law is and the definition of the law and the purpose of the law. We'll start off here with a definition from Merriam-Webster. There's many different definitions, by the way, of law. We're just going to start here with the definition of law from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. A binding custom or practice of a community, a rule of conduct or action prescribed or formally recognized as binding or enforced by a controlling authority. Note we have a couple key terms in here. We have something that is going to be binding and something that can be enforced. So we're talking about something that can be enforced and is binding, and therefore there has to be some type of authority in order to make those something to be enforced and binding. We're talking about rules of conduct, so rules of behavior, and they're going to be enforced by some type of authority within this definition. As we look at this definition, we may still have some questions as to what exactly is a binding custom and what is a formally recognized, what does it mean to be formally recognized, when is something formally recognized, and what exactly is a controlling authority, and is there some kind of objective means for which somebody has some type of controlling authority. So we'll talk a bit more about that. When we look at the goals of society, sometimes we define things in terms of what their purpose is. We might say that we want to have some harmony in society, we want to have some stability in society, we need to have some justice in society, and those are types of things that give us and drive us towards this need for the laws and regulations that we put upon ourselves in some ways. When thinking about what the law actually does, we're going to say that the law is going to give some type of rights, it's going to give some rights to us, and it's going to restrict some rights in some way, meaning we can have a positive format of those rights saying that these are things that are permitted, and we could have some negative format of the rights saying that these things are not permitted. So for example, within the U.S. Constitution, you have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are going to be formatted in terms of the positive rights, and then the negative rights would be something like you cannot do this, you cannot do that, in terms of things that are not permissible. Defines and means of enforcement. We are going to have, of course, a means of enforcement within these practices in order to be able to enforce the laws. This process helps to manage the society and helps us to have a society that is more manageable. When we think about the enforcement of the law, we typically think of the government as the body that will be enforcing the law, and therefore the government actions in order to enforce it have to be justified in some way. There's two things that the government are going to be looking out to do, and that is going to be one, to protect their own existence. The government needs to be there in order to be able to enforce the laws, and then to protect the lives, the health, and the well-being of its own citizens. That's the goal of the government. So as long as we see that the government is applying those standards, we typically would think that the justice or the actions of the government are justified. So there's a couple different theories that we can think of as to whether or not they are achieving those objectives of lives, health, and well-being of the citizens. And that takes into account some types of theory, often some types of moral theories. It depends how you see things in terms of what actions would be justified by government in enforcement of the law. This then brings in the concept of ethics and values. So when we think about ethics and values, that helps us to decide whether or not we think certain laws are just, and the different thoughts in terms of ethics and values will lead to different conclusions. People have had and continue to have debates over which values are more important and which values are going to need to be enforced. And these types of things, some would argue, would change over time. Others would argue that there are some values that are going to be constant over time, And these thoughts, these different thoughts, will lead towards different conclusions as to what ethics are, and therefore what laws should be in place in order to coincide with those ethical thoughts. So ethical values are society's collective thoughts about values and rights and wrong toward good and evil. A society's values are not equivalent to the laws, but they do give a guideline as to which laws are going to be created most likely. The idea of ethics itself could be thought of as an attempt to find fundamental values that should be followed. The idea of ethics itself being something that has been thought about for a long period of time, and there's still going to be a lot of disagreement on that, and we'll take a look at some of those ethical theories and where those differentiations lie. Those are usually the more interesting questions in terms of both ethical theory and in terms of laws, when there's differing values, or we have competing values that we both values are good, and which one is more important, and those are usually the questions that are interesting both in law and ethics. When thinking about the idea of what law is, we'll start with a concept probably going to be familiar in thought to U.S. thinkers, and that's going to be the idea of natural law. Our Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, is based in part on concepts related to natural law. Natural law is a big topic, so it does cover a lot of ground, and there's different thoughts and sects within the concept of natural law. But the fundamental idea is the idea that there's some fundamental set of principles that guide behavior and should be followed. Meaning there's going to be some set of principles that you can think of as part of nature. They're going to be a natural law similar to a scientific law, in that there are things that can be discovered and then found, and once discovered, there's certain things that are universal in terms of ethical nature, and therefore those things should always be part of the law and be included within the law. In other words, if the formal authority goes against what is the natural law, which can be laid out, it was laid out in a way in the Constitution, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If formal authority goes against those natural rights, then you could appeal to the natural law as a stronger authority than any formal authority that is taking away those types of rights. That's kind of the idea of the natural law, that there's some set of principles that are going to be universal, and that'll be the ultimate law that you can kind of appeal to, which would be that natural law. Now, the concept of natural law fits nicely into the idea of a higher being or one God type of being. So many Christian thinkers would adopt the theory of a natural law concept and apply, of course, that a natural law would be something that was part of a law from a God's law or something like that. And that's definitely applicable. It doesn't need to be applied, however, to have the concept of a natural law. We could think of a natural law such as things that we will discover in time, as we have in terms of physics or something like that, that we tend towards. And if we apply these natural laws, that would be the best format of living. So it is possible to think about it in terms of a higher being, or in terms of just nature. Before ancient thinkers and prior to the birth of Christ, we see concepts and people appealing to things like a natural law, like something higher than the immediate authority over them, even though the immediate authority over them may have the idea of formal law and be able to tell them what to do and have punishments related to certain actions. We see appeals to some other format, some higher law, and some higher set of law, and that would be the kind of idea of the natural laws. Ethical relativism, on the other hand, is going to be counter to the idea of natural laws in many ways, meaning that there is no right or wrong in terms of a relative type of thinking. The relative would basically say that things will change over time, and things are going to change in terms of circumstance and situation and personal preference, and therefore there's no set of principles that we can adhere to that will be constant over a set of time. When considering this concept, that would mean that some type of behavior would only be able to be judged in the context of that type of behavior, in terms of what the situation was, as well as the times, in terms of the values of a particular time period. Now, you can look at these two types of theories, this theory in terms of natural laws and this theory in terms of relativism, and see how some people might think that it might apply in terms of different types of laws. There's going to be some types of laws that some people might think are going to be universal in some ways, and some types of laws that may change based on customs of a certain area. For example, if we encounter a society that has a law that says it's going to be legal in order to sacrifice children, many would still argue that this law would not be a valid law and appeal to some higher authority, some higher set of ethical laws in some way, some type of natural laws. On the other hand, if there's some type of law that says that you're going to drive on the left or right side of the road, then this is a type of law that could change from society to society, and people would not have much argument in terms of whether or not it's a right or wrong law, as long as it is enforced. Now, these examples are a bit extreme, especially that second one being totally arbitrary in terms of law. There's not really any ethical judgment in terms of if you're on the left side or the right side of the road. But the arguments where there's a lot of contention in when we talk about things on, is killing okay? Is, what in terms of war and things like that, when is it okay to kill, or topics, euthanasia type topic, abortion type topics. Those are the ones where there's argument between these types of theories, and that's where the interesting area is in terms of what would be applicable in terms of laws and ethics. When considering what law is, we need to consider where it came from. When did we start having more formal law and more formal authority? It's going to happen when people start to gather together in societies. So when people started to group more into larger societies, we have more groups of people. We have a need to regulate and manage those groups of people more and more, and that's going to lead to some more laws that are going to be applied. Some have defined this in terms of the concept of a social contract theory. Social contract thinkers would be people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, are two of the most famous social contract thinkers. And this is going to give the idea that we as a society are giving up some of our freedoms in order to be regulated by a government in some way. And in so doing, we're receiving more than we're giving up. So there's some type of social contract that we're imagining that we have. People within a society giving up certain rights to an authority, giving power to an authority in some way in order to achieve goals, in order to have some harmony, in order to be able to pursue, and John Locke's idea, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In order to do that, and John Locke's original was the pursuit of property, which is the idea of being able to have property and be able to accumulate property without having to worry constantly about that property being stolen, which makes it difficult to accumulate property or not worthwhile to do so if that's the case. The two thinkers, if we think about Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, Thomas Hobbes was in a lot more turbulent time period, and therefore his idea was that we need we're giving our authority to an absolute authority, possibly a monarch, and he was in favor of a very strong central monarchy authority, and one that can then put order into a society and giving up whatever rights are needed in order to get that order that is needed. So when you're in, of course, a turbulent time, he's looking for a very strong centralized government, and his concept of before that government was what we call a state of nature. And it's not what we might think of now. We typically think of a state of nature as kind of possibly a good thing, living, going back to nature or something. But in terms of Thomas Hobbes, the state of nature is not a good thing. He says it's solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, in short, is how he describes the state of nature. In order to get away from the state of nature where everybody's just competing with each other and causing problems for each other, then we need to have this social contract theory and give power to a strong central authority that can enforce some types of laws. John Locke, of course, is going to take some concepts from that social contract theory, but give the idea that there's going to be these natural rights within the contract theory, and the idea that we will govern ourselves through some type of process rather than have a central monarch type of government. So it's going to be a modification of this contract theory based on this idea of natural laws, that the government, whatever that government is there in essence to preserve in some way and enforce those natural laws, which can be defined as the pursuit of life, liberty, and property or happiness. The government's main purpose is to enforce those laws, and that will allow people to pursue those natural rights and therefore thrive. When thinking about ethical theories that are going to drive behavior and therefore often drive our actions in terms of law and possibly the justifications for punishment in certain areas of law, we have a couple that are competing in nature in terms of what ethical theories are and how we should behave. One is a type of absolutism, meaning there's a certain set of rules that we should always be able to follow. It's more of a Kantian type of idea. And that's going to be the idea that if we apply something universally and we say this act is something that can be universally applied, and if it's something that we think would be good if applied universally, then it's something that we should do. If not, then it's something that we should not do. And there's some benefits to this kind of idea, and there's some problems with this kind of idea. The benefits are that we have a set of laws that are very universal, and we know exactly what they are. If we can apply these out, if we can think through that process, then we can apply that Kantian idea and come up with a universal set of principles. The problem is that if we get to some thought processes, it seems to lead to outcomes that don't seem morally right. So it might be okay in some instances, but as a general rule, but if we apply it all the time, we can think of thought processes where it wouldn't apply. For example, the classic example is in terms of lying. We typically say that if I was to lie myself for personal benefit, it might have personal benefit, but if I was to say that everybody was able to lie in a particular situation, then of course there would be no such thing. There would be no trust in the world. And that would then be a bad thing for society, and therefore morally bad, and therefore lying is wrong at any level. It's always a bad thing, because if you're lying, then and you apply that universally, it would be a bad result. So therefore you can't lie. Now, of course, if we think of a situation where lying might be a virtue, if we had an axe murderer come into the door that just is trying to find the 4-year-old that just ran through your kitchen, then it might be a virtuous thing. Many would argue to lie to the axe murderer and say that the 4-year-old is not there and is someplace else. And under a purely Kantian idea of this absolutism, that would be a conclusion that would not be given, and therefore it's often thought that that's going to be some type of flaw. There's some type of thing that needs to be adjusted there. Some people have tried to adjust that by basically saying, well, we'll narrow down the situation. You know, it's a rule that's as absolute. If a particular situation is applied, you can lie. If there's an axe murderer outside and there's a 4-year-old that ran through your kitchen and whatnot. But if you narrow down everything to a very limited set of theories, then the theory becomes not very useful in and of itself either. So you have to have a sufficiently broad enough a theory for that absolute type of theory to be applicable, and that's going to be one of the problems. Another type of theory that was used in order to think about rules and moral conduct, what should we do, that's going to be the idea of utilitarianism. And that's from Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill are going to be founders or idealists or people who thought through the utilitarianism type of thought process. And that's going to be the idea that your behaviors are going to be changed. It's this idea of the ends justify the means, the idea that, you know, whatever the ultimate outcomes will be, if they're better under one set of conditions than the other set of conditions, then you should do the thing that the outcomes will be better. So that's going to be the other thought process on this. And once again, this gets us to a lot. This is really useful many times that we can think through ideas and moral consequences and say, would it be better for us to lie to the axe murderer at the door, or better for us not to lie and say, I think it's better to lie at this point in time, and therefore utilitarianism seems to make sense. It seems to solve that type of problem, whereas an absolutism idea has a problem there. But on the other hand, there's situations where people get uncomfortable with, and that's going to be things such as, is it okay to sacrifice, for example, one individual who's completely innocent in order to save two individuals over here, right? There'd be more happiness, there'd be more utility to save the two individuals. Is it okay to sacrifice one innocent individual? And obviously, if you multiply that by scale, what if there's 3 individuals, 4 individuals? Is it okay to, for example, torture an innocent person or something like that? So there's a lot of thought experiments that are of that nature. And a lot of movies, of course, have this dichotomy in terms of the thought process of one individual possibly being a utilitarian thinker and the other individual being a thinker of some absolutist type of thought process. For example, if we think of the movie Batman against the Joker, we see that the Batman always has the ability to kill the Joker, but he thinks that killing is wrong. It's in his utilitarian concepts for Batman. That's the one line he doesn't cross, so he's not going to kill the Joker, and therefore he never does. But the Joker, under a utilitarian thought process, if you were to think in a utilitarian thought process, he's an individual that keeps killing people, and a utilitarian would probably come to the conclusion that killing that one individual, although it might conflict with your ultimate thought process, might provide the most benefit and therefore be justified under a utilitarian type of analysis. So these type of concepts, this argument between utilitarian concepts and absolute concepts is an interesting argument, because it does provide, neither one of these two situations provides a set of rules that we can universally apply and just on a gut level feels right under any type of thought process or scenario that we can think about. So we don't have really a set of principles that we can always go by. Another problem with utilitarianism also, of course, is that we don't know what the ultimate outcome is. So we can try to measure it in some way, and we can try to say, what is ultimate happiness? Is one person's happiness better than another person's happiness? Do we have to judge whether this person is a good person versus another person being a bad person, and therefore weigh the happiness relative to them differently? And there's been different arguments on this, whether everything should be equal. What is happiness in and of itself? Is there a difference between, just physical happiness versus some deeper happiness in some way? Some people think there's different layers of happiness. So the idea of measurements of one, what utility is, and two, being able to measure the utility before doing an action is a difficult, and those are going to be some obstacles to the concept of utilitarianism. We can see how these concepts would apply to the act of law and the creation of the law and how the law is going to be formatted. However, if we say something that's going to be absolute, is absolutely morally true or false, then when we look at the law, when we look at applying the law, then we'd have to apply it black and white. If, killing is wrong, if you killed under any circumstances, killing the Joker would be, of course, wrong in any considered situation. Or we can see situations where we're looking more at circumstance, and we've got to consider the circumstance and adjust the laws accordingly with that. So we can see how these ideas of what's morally right typically are going to be some guiding principles in terms of how laws are both created and then how laws are going to be applied. When considering the law in terms of the creation, you often have the argument of how flexible do you need the law to be? How should we term the law? How can we allow for some flexibility possibly? And how can we make it rigid enough to apply throughout? We also see that same type of dichotomy, the same type of problems in terms of interpreting the law. When we look at the judges that are making cases on the laws, we have to say, well, the judge is not there to interpret or make law. They are there to interpret the law, not to make the law. And we have questions in terms of, are they making the law by interpreting it in certain ways? Do they have any leeway to interpret based on the circumstance, or do they just need to apply the letter of the law? And these concepts between absolutism and utilitarian thinking are types of ideas that come into play when we look at those problems. So in conclusion, we can see some relationships between law and ethics. We can see that the ethics is going to be the idea of what is right and wrong, what should we do, what should we not do. And the law is going to be the idea of enforcing certain things that are going to be in alignment with the principles of the society, or at least the people that are in control of a particular society. And often one drives the others. So the idea of ethics can lead people to do what they think is ethical, but of course not everybody needs to do what they think is ethical, and they may have differences in terms of what we think of ethics is between different values within ethics, and what is ethical behavior from person to person might change, from culture to culture, depending on our concept of what ethics are. The law then can apply those principles and stop people from doing what is thought to be within a particular culture or particular group or particular society wrong, has the power to enforce certain behavior and suppress